So I'm Mark Moss. I'm head of the psychology department at Northumbria University. I came to psychology relatively late in life. I was 30, just turned when I started studying psychology. And my main research interest has been the enhancement of cognitive performance. Now, most of the work that I've done, to be perfectly honest, has been looking at people who have no pre-existing conditions. So I've not been, most of the work that I've done has looked at healthy adults, healthy children, all different ages, to see if we can improve performance by natural interventions. But this has also, over time, started to drift into a little bit of work relating to, as we're talking about here, sort of brain fog, and trying to use natural interventions that can possibly help with that. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from.
And now, could you give us a little bit of an outline of your research that you've done? Okay, so
in a few moments, I'm going to go through some slides that are going to cover a number of different elements of my research. But basically, I'm going to talk about research that begins with looking at oxygen administration and then moves through to rosemary, which is sort of the more current focus of my research. And a lot of it has been around rosemary aroma, the aroma of the essential oil. But as you'll hear as well, I've also looked at oral administration of rosemary extracts as well. So yes, I'm going to talk about how these different interventions may or hopefully can help with some elements of cognitive performance, memory, attention, alertness, and things like
that. And what got you into actually finding about rosemary? Where did that come up? How did you come across that?
So, well, that's not an idea of my own. I was introduced to it, to the idea of rosemary by a student who I was supervising for her final year honours project, and she wanted to look at rosemary, and I had no knowledge of it at all at the time. But that's how I got into it and found it fascinating, and all of a sudden found that actually rosemary has got a reputation to be associated with memory throughout history. It's nothing new, and certainly not a discovery that I've made. It's one of these things that people have known for years and years and years, but nobody had really done any research on it, as with so many things.
You have a Shakespeare quote, I think, don't you, to prove it?
I do indeed, yes. That's one of my favourites. It's in here, actually, somewhere.
Well, do you want to go into your slides then, and
yeah,
we'll cover everything then, and any questions, as I say, that people have got along the way, please ask, and we'll do our best to cover them either during the session or at the end. Thank you.
Yeah, I can't actually see at the moment, Jane, the chat window, yep. So I won't be able to see any questions as they come up at the moment.
I've just minimized my screen, and I will keep tabs on it, and if it's relevant, I'll drop it in, and then, as I say, I'll save it to the end if need be.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much. Okay, so hopefully you can see my opening slide. Clearing the fog, research into natural psychopharmacology. And I use the word natural quite with intent there, because I'm very much someone who believes in looking at things that are natural, things that we do in our, or could do in our everyday lives reasonably simply, rather than looking for some kind of novel or manufactured intervention. So we've got a nice picture there of the fog on the Tyne, which we don't see too much of nowadays, to be perfectly honest. But although I've got a picture, I had a picture there of fog on the Tyne, it's, as put here, it's basically everywhere. And the most common sort of areas that people talk about brain fog at the moment, it seems to be chronic fatigue syndrome, which of course has been around and we've been aware of for a number of years. Going through the menopause transition seems to be an area where brain fog is particularly pertinent. And currently, in the last year or two, of course, this idea of long COVID. And I've often thought since the start of COVID and this introduction of the idea of long COVID, very frustrating it must be for people who've been suffering from brain fog over the years to all of a sudden have it as a condition that is recognized by medical science and being attended to, whereas for many years it's almost been pushed to one side. But it means that at least there is some attention being focused on it. And typically people talk about problems with their memory, their attention, their levels of energy, and their alertness. So being a psychologist, of course, I'm very much interested in the human brain, and one of the things that really got me interested in the brain in the first place is how incredibly active the brain is compared to the rest of the human body. So it's massively disproportionately metabolically active for its size. It uses lots and lots of energy. So it's only about 2% of an average human's body mass, but it uses, when we are resting, 20% of all the body's energy use. It uses huge amounts of energy. So it obviously needs a constant and regular supply of energy. And the way that it gets its energy is very much the same as the rest of the body. So we take in food, broken down into proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. And it is largely the glucose that comes from carbohydrates that provides us with our energy. And it provides us with our energy for our brains. All of the energy, not quite true, but very nearly all of the energy comes from the oxidative metabolism of glucose. So we need oxygen and a constant supply of oxygen in order for us to metabolize glucose and provide our brain with the energy that it requires. Two things quite interesting about this is that the brain has very, very limited storage facilities. It can store a very small amount of glucose as its energy fuel, and it can store no oxygen as the other part of the energy metabolism. So whenever we need energy in our brains, and as I showed, it needs an awful lot of energy, it means that we have to deliver oxygen to the brain for that energy. So when you do something that's particularly cognitively demanding, so something that requires your brain to trying to learn something, or when you're trying to manipulate things, doing mental arithmetic, particularly something like that, what you find is that your heart rate goes up. Why does your heart rate go up? Your heart rate goes up because your brain is calling out for more fuel and more oxygen because it's trying to do all of this work. And so one of the first things that I was interested in, and based on this idea that the brain is unable to store any oxygen for this demand, is that I thought about looking at the idea of whether breathing pure oxygen as opposed to just normal air, which is what, about 21% oxygen, could deliver more oxygen to the brain and therefore provide it with the opportunity to develop more energy at a time of demand and therefore improve performance. And our first paper came out back in 1996, where we had a group of healthy young students who we either gave them pure oxygen to breathe or just standard air to breathe, and gave them a word list to learn, and then tested their recall. And we found that those that had been breathing the pure oxygen performed better at word recall. They were able to remember more words than those that had been breathing the ordinary air. And we ran a number of different studies in this area that demonstrated that breathing the pure oxygen did significantly increase blood oxygen levels. And at the time when the blood oxygen levels were at the highest, that was the period when memory recall was enhanced the most. And our basic theory around this was around the idea that you get the enhancement because you can produce more energy at a time of demand if you have got additional oxygen available to you. It works almost in the same way as athletes training at altitude. When athletes train at altitude, the reason they train at altitude is because there is less oxygen around. So if you're training at altitude, your blood synthesizes more red blood cells so that you can carry more oxygen around in your blood. You then come down to sea level and you've still got all these extra red blood cells down, so they can carry more oxygen, so they can deliver more oxygen to your muscles, and you can perform better. And so it's the same idea, is that you need energy for these things. If you provide more of the fuels, you get better performance. And following this work that we did, another graduate student of ours was interested in chronic fatigue syndrome and ran a study to see the effect of having pure oxygen on performance in people who are suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome. And what they found was that having pure oxygen significantly improved reaction time on simple and choice reaction time tasks. So people were able to perform quicker than they were without it. The difference did not bring them down to what you might call healthy or uncompromised levels, but there was still an improvement in terms of reaction time. One thing that wasn't affected, though, was something we call cognitive reaction time, which is another way of looking at it, is thinking time. So although they were able to perform better in terms of speed, their thinking time didn't seem to be improved by oxygen. But as well as reaction time, they also looked at memory. And what they did was they compared 3 different groups. So they had a control group of chronic fatigue sufferers who were breathing just normal air, a chronic fatigue sufferers group who were breathing oxygen, and a control group of people who weren't suffering from fatigue. And what we found was that, as expected, the chronic fatigue sufferers who were just breathing air would perform more poorly on the memory tasks than the healthy people who were breathing air as well. But, and in the black bar that's on the right-hand side here, when we gave a group of chronic fatigue sufferers oxygen to breathe, their performance was improved so that it fell somewhere between that of the sufferers and the healthy controls. So they were improved to the point that they were no longer, in fact, significantly less good at the memory task. So this supported our suggestion that part of chronic fatigue syndrome, at least in part, is to do with energy levels, the brain's ability to create the energy required to engage with various different cognitive tasks, and that if you gave supplemental oxygen, there's an opportunity to make a difference. It doesn't change it exactly, but it does make a difference, or potentially can make a difference. One of the things about using oxygen as an intervention is that the amount of time that you can actually spend breathing pure oxygen is reasonably limited, because the brain has evolved to work in an atmosphere of 21% oxygen. If you're breathing 100% oxygen, then as with so many things, too much of something, a little of something can do you good, too much of it is not necessarily helpful. And so it is with oxygen. We did studies where we demonstrated that if people breathe pure oxygen constantly for a period of over 30 minutes, then rather than having a beneficial effect, it started having no effect and then started to have even a detrimental effect. So it's not the sort of thing that you can just maintain constantly. But as I say, some beneficial effects there. And when we were doing this, we started just looking around to see what people had done in terms of oxygen administration previously, and there really hadn't been that much done at all in terms of acute effects on cognition by this short-term breathing of oxygen. But we did find some quite interesting things that had been marketed in the past, particularly in the 1960s in America. They were selling oxygen backpacks for people, so that you could put a backpack on which had an oxygen canister in it and could feed you oxygen. And that, we thought that was really funny at the time. But of course, nowadays, you can go to just about any sort of chemist, health food store and buy yourself a small handheld canister of pure oxygen that can be used to deliver small amounts of oxygen. Now, the only issue that I have with some of these canisters is that I'm not sure, and I haven't done the research, but I've got some plan actually with these small canisters, whether you're going to be able to be breathing enough pure oxygen to actually significantly increase the blood saturation from oxygen that you would through a normal sort of breathing mask of the sort of that we used in our research. But it's something that I'm going to look at. Anyway, so there we were, working with oxygen. And we kind, I suppose to some extent, reached something of an impasse, because you get to the state where you think, well, you can't be using it all the time. So what else is are we going to be looking at? But what I did find particularly interesting at this time was the fact that, so this was the 1990s, late 1990s, and oh, excuse my cat in the background. It's come in to tell me he wants his lunch. You'll have to wait, Spike. Be quiet. Be quiet. I'm talking. What happened? What was going on a lot in the 1990s is that around the world, oxygen bars were opening in a lot of cities, particularly cities where there might have been problems with air pollution and similar, but these became very, very popular around the world, where people would go into these oxygen bars and you would pay a certain amount of money and they would give you a little nose tube like these have got on here, a little nasal cannula, hook you up to an oxygen supply. You'd breathe this oxygen for 2, 3, 5 minutes and then go about your day. And there were two things that I found particularly interesting about these oxygen bars. And one of the things was that self-reports of people who were coming out of these oxygen bars were saying, oh, it's really good, it makes me feel very alert, it livens me up. Or some people were coming out and saying they were feeling more relaxed or calmer from having their oxygen and these sorts of things. And we found this particularly interesting because in the research that we had done, we found that people, the way they actually said they felt, they couldn't distinguish whether they had been breathing pure oxygen or air. So these people who were going to these oxygen bars were coming out of the oxygen bars and were reporting effects that we hadn't found in our research for the effect of oxygen. So, well, what is it that's going on here? And the answer that sort of sprang to my mind was, and if you look at these canisters in this oxygen bar picture here, if you can see them, the slightly different colors, what happens is they've got the oxygen bubbling through water, and this is so that people can see that they're getting oxygen, because they can see the bubbles, because otherwise you've just got a pipe and it could be anything. But they've also got these colors, and what they did was they flavored the oxygen they were giving people. So they were giving people oxygen that was flavored with peppermint or with chamomile and things like this. And so that makes it, well, perhaps it wasn't the oxygen that was making them feel different. It was perhaps the aroma that they were inhaling with it. Peppermint, of course, very much being related to alertness, and chamomile to relaxation. And so that sort of very much chimed with my research student coming along and saying they wanted to look at the essential oil of rosemary and look at memory. And so I said, well, I've no idea what's rosemary got to do with memory. And so she gave me a little bit of background, and I did a bit of digging around. And one of my favorite quotes that I always use, or very often use in my talks, is from Shakespeare. What better academic resource could you possibly have for your research than the bard? If he wrote about it, it's you know, it's pretty high level. Anyway, it comes from Hamlet, Act 4, Scene 5, and Ophelia says, "There's rosemary, that's for remembrance." And so there's a very clear sort of social historical reference to rosemary being associated with memory. And then if you look at all the pharmacopoeia throughout all the centuries, you always see rosemary there as being described as a superior herb related to memory. And it's like ages, wisdom of ages lost, or still going on, but the research has just not been done into it. So it's really encouraging to get involved in that level of research. I also, when I talk about Shakespeare and Ophelia particularly, is that I do have to point out that Ophelia might not be the best source of truth, though, because when she says that, she's actually mad as pies. So not exactly the best source of truth, perhaps. But anyway, still, historically, there it is. So you look into rosemary and you find that rosemary is identified as being a herb that is invigorating. It stimulates the central nervous system. And found some animal work that had been done that looked at rosemary, and found that they'd used rosemary aroma and they'd put it in animals' cages, and they'd found that the animals became more alert, they became more active, they started running around more, and their respiration rate went up as well. So it does appear to have central nervous system activity. So in our first study, we used, again, groups of healthy students, if healthy and students is not an oxymoron. And we had 3 groups, and we had one group who did a range of computerized cognitive tests in a cubicle that had rosemary aroma diffused in it, another group who had lavender aroma diffused in the cubicle, and we used lavender aroma because lavender is a sedative, and so we thought it's going to have a different, if there's going to be an effect, they're going to be different, so we'll see some difference between them. And we had a control group who had no aroma in their cubicle. So we ran them through these all these tests, and one of the things that we do in these studies, it's always interesting when we do these aroma studies, because we don't want our participants to know that it's an aroma study, because we don't want them to have some level of expectancy that, oh, it's going to affect the way I perform, and so they try harder or try less or whatever. So we always lie to our participants about what they're doing, and we tell them they're coming in to do some tests on the computer about something else. And if they mention that there's an aroma in the cubicle, we just tell them, oh, I don't know what that's there for. It was somebody was in here doing something before us. We don't know. Just to throw them off the scent, if you'll excuse the pun. Anyway, this study, we found a significant improvement in long-term memory compared to both the lavender group and the control group in these studies. when we combined all the different memory tests, we got this overall significant improvement for Rosemary. And this was something that we were really, really excited about. It opened the area up to us certainly to consider in greater detail. And the paper that reports this outcome now, it's been cited over 500 times in other research studies. It's one of the sort of cornerstones of the aroma research in the literature now. And what we also found was that our Rosemary group did also feel more alert. So they not only performed better, but they actually felt more aroused, more alert. And that could have been related to their performance, because if you're more alert, you can focus on things and concentrate on things more. Interestingly, though, in our subsequent research, we've never found a strong correlation between how people actually feel and how well they do. So it's not a strong relationship. So the two things seem to be separate. The effect on memory seems to be slightly separate to the effect on subjective alertness, which is interesting in its own right. Anyway, this got us thinking about, well, how is Rosemary having this effect on memory? What's going on? And so we go back to the brain. Brain, of course, made up of billions upon billions of little nerve cells that are all connected to one another. And they're all connected to one another by what are called synapses, where messages get passed from one nerve cell to another. And memory is consolidated by the strengthening of the links between these nerve cells across these synapses. And if you'll excuse a little bit more science, what happens at a synapse when you are learning? There are particular synapses where acetylcholine is passed from one nerve cell to another. And acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter. It's the compound. It's often been described as memory's postman. So it posts the information from one nerve cell to another, and that is what strengthens memories. So what we have is acetylcholine gets passed from one nerve cell, so the upper nerve cell in this particular image, it gets passed through to the lower nerve cell, where it attaches to a cholinergic receptor, and that passes the message on. Under normal circumstances, what happens then is that it gets released and it gets broken down. Acetylcholine gets broken down into its constituent parts, and you get a bit of a circle of reabsorption and then resynthesis, and then it's ready for release again. But there is a compound in, well, there's more than one compound in rosemary essential oil that effectively stops that breakdown of acetylcholine when it is released from the receptor. What that means is that acetylcholine is then free to have its action again, because it's floating around between those two nerve cells. And so rather than being broken down, it can be absorbed again onto a receptor and pass its message on again, and it gets released again, and it doesn't get broken down, it gets passed on again. This compound, or the major compound that does this, is something that's called 1,8-cineol. It's a small little organic compound, small enough to get passed through the blood-brain barrier. That's something that's really important here, because the brain has the blood-brain barrier that's there to stop compounds getting in there and messing up with the way that it works. 1,8-cineol is small enough to actually get through the blood-brain barrier, so it can get into the brain to have this effect. This is interesting on a number of different levels. First of all, it makes sense that if it can act on this system that stops the breakdown of acetylcholine, it could affect memory. It's also interesting because all of the anti-dementia drugs that are available to medicine at the moment work on the same principle. We know that acetylcholine is massively affected in dementia, and all of the anti-dementia drugs effectively work on the cholinergic system to stop the breakdown of acetylcholine and to try and engage its enhanced activity. So from a scientific perspective, you've got something in rosemary that effectively can impact on the way the brain works and in the area where memories are consolidated. As I say, that's 1,8-cineol. There are a number of other compounds, and I'll talk about those in a little bit, that are also involved. Okay, so how can we show that this 1,8-cineol is actually potentially having the effect? Well, we moved on to do some further research that we've done with adults and also with healthy elderly participants that looks at a different aspect of memory. It's an aspect of memory that is very typically under-researched, but is absolutely crucial for daily functioning, our ability to remember to remember. So this is something that's called prospective memory. And basically, it's remembering to do the things that we have to do during the day. So like me, you've probably left the house at some time in your life with a letter in your pocket that you're going to post when you go past the post box on the way to work, and you get home in the evening and it's still in your pocket because your prospective memory failed you. You forgot to remember to do something in the future. And so it's a really, really important part of our everyday lives. It's a little bit harder to test, actually, but there is a lab-based test that we use that was developed at the University of Cambridge, where you get participants to sit at a table with you for about 45 minutes, and at various different events and times during the procedure, they have to do certain things. And so you can measure their ability to remember to do them. And these get broken down into what are called event-based memory and time-based memory. Event-based memory is doing something when something happens in the future, and time-based is doing something when it gets to a certain time. And we compared rosemary to a control no aroma group, and we found that both event-based and time-based prospective memory were significantly enhanced by rosemary aroma. So people remembered to do things in the future better when there was rosemary aroma there. But what we also did is at the end of the testing session, we got our legalized vampires into the lab, and we took a blood sample from each of the participants. We then sent the blood samples off to the lab and got them analyzed for concentrations of 1,8-cineol in the blood. Because we know it's in the essential oil, we believe that it goes into the aroma because it's a volatile compound, but we wanted to be able to see if it is being absorbed by our participants. And we found that it was. Not only was it absorbed, but we found that there was a correlation between the amount that had been absorbed by the participants and their performance on the prospective memory task. Now, it's not a massively strong relationship, but it's still a relationship that the more they had absorbed, the better that they did. And that occurred for both the event-based tasks and the time-based tasks. So more 1,8-cineol absorbed, better performance on the tasks. Just a little bit of an aside in terms of event-based and time-based prospective memory. Typically, people do better at event-based prospective memory than time-based prospective memory. We're better at doing things when something else occurs than when a particular time occurs. And that's often the case of why you're given medication to take 3 times a day with meals rather than 3 times at given times, because it's easier to remember to take it because, oh, I'm having my dinner I need to take my medicine, rather than, oh, it's 8 o'clock, I've got to do something. But just a little aside there. Okay, so there we've got a relationship between actually absorbing the compounds into your blood and performing better. So the link between essential oil, aroma, performance is really looking quite interesting. Okay, so now moving on now to another area that we got involved in, and this was a consequence of actually being contacted by a manufacturer of a rosemary water drink that has an extract of rosemary in it, and they wanted to see if it had any potential benefits on cognition as well. And so we did a couple of studies on this rosemary water. We also had it analysed for its constituent parts, and it contains 1,8-cineol and other compounds that are in the essential oil. So it had the right stuff in there potentially, it could be absorbed. The first study that we did, we used what's called a multitasking framework. So we did this just out of interest as much as anything. The multitasking framework, effectively, you have 4 different tasks on this screen, and you have to deal with all of these 4 tasks at the same time. The framework was developed to actually induce stress in people. And it really is quite stressful to try and keep on top of all of those 4 tasks at the same time on the screen. And so there are publications from the people also at Northumbria who developed it that demonstrate that it does increase people's stress response. We wanted to see whether there was any impact of rosemary water on the stress response to doing these tasks. So we ran a number of people through it. We compared the rosemary water to a control group who just drank ordinary water, and we found that those who had the rosemary water reported slightly less stress, same sort of pattern of responses as they went through the multitasking framework. So basically you get them to do it for about 20 minutes and it becomes very stressful after that period of time. And then at the end of it, when they stop doing it, the stress response goes down. Also, because these are also cognitive tasks that are quite stressful, you typically find an increase in heart rate as well, which we also found in the control group. But there was a slight increase in heart rate in the rosemary water group, but it wasn't anything like the same size. So the rosemary water appeared to make people enabled to do the tasks in a manner and actually feel less stressed from it as well. The other study that we did involved something called near infrared spectroscopy. So what this is a device that shines red light through the skull, and this then gets bounced back to sensors on this headband, and the amount of red light that's absorbed by the brain is measured, and this is a measure of how much oxygen there is in the blood in the brain. So it's a measure of metabolic activity in the brain. So I'm kind of going right back to the start with links to oxygen to some extent. Did a number of different cognitive tasks here as well. Found improvements on a range of them. Of course, it blocks this kind of a spatial memory task of which block lit up when. Serial 3s and serial 7s, really nice tasks that are very demanding. I love serial 7s. It's the worst task I think there is in the world. So you get given a number like 973, and then you have to take 7 away from that and put in your answer. Take 7 away from that. What's the answer? Take 7 away from that. What's the answer? And it's just really, really, really hard. And then, of course, word recall, which is a standard task that we did as well. Now, these improvements aren't huge, but they're there. they're noticeable. It's it's just under a word in terms of number of words recalled or something like that. And I always think it's important to stress whenever I talk about my research is that none of this is a fix for everything. It's not a panacea. It's not, I haven't got the answer to all the problems of the world, but there are benefits that can be gleaned. And that's the most important thing, I think, that is the message to get over. Last thing from the near infrared spectroscopy is what's going on in the blood in the brain then. So these are the two lines that represent the Rosemary water group, the placebo group, in terms of, this is the amount of oxygen that's in the that's in the blood in the brain. Or this particular figure, this particular graph, is the amount of blood in the brain that's actually had the oxygen stripped from it. And throughout the testing procedure, the Rosemary water group had got more oxygen stripped from the blood than had the control group. So what this suggests to us, and we've got a number of people who've done work in this area, is that this is indicating that the Rosemary is facilitating the brain's ability to use the oxygen because there is more being taken out of the blood. So as I say, this links back to my earlier stuff with giving people oxygen. In this case, we're not giving people oxygen, but we're giving people something that can facilitate the brain's ability to extract the oxygen that's there from the blood, therefore perhaps providing, again, more energy to the brain. Okay, so where am I now? Well, currently, I'm getting towards the end of a project that was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council that's looking at rosemary in menopause, because as I said at the start, menopause transition is a period of women's life where often they report problems with memory, with attention. And I'm doing this work in combination with an occupational psychologist from Lancaster University, because she's interested in the menopause and job satisfaction, work efficiency, and such like, because many women find that whilst they're going through the menopause transition, their ability to concentrate at work and perform at work to their best ability is challenged. And so we wanted to see if there's a way that we can actually improve the situation for women as they go through the menopause. So the study is, as I say, still ongoing at the moment. We've recruited 120 women who were recruited way back in February. And then in the subsequent months, we've allocated them to one of three groups. They're either in a rosemary aroma group, a rosemary water group, or a control group. And we sent out to them the rosemary water or the essential oil and diffusers so that they can either have rosemary water every day for 3 months or can expose themselves to rosemary aroma every day for 30 minutes for 3 months. And then they are being tested. They got tested 3 times before the intervention, and then they've been tested every month while the intervention's going on, and 1 more post-intervention on a battery of online cognitive tests that you can actually complete on your mobile phone, and a range of subjective assessments as well in terms of how they feel in themselves, what their mood's like, and how they feel they're getting on at work, and their productivity and things like that. We are approaching the end of testing, so it's getting to that exciting time of a research project where you don't know quite what you're going to find until you've got all the data in, but we'll know within the next month exactly whether there's been any benefit or not. If there has been a benefit, you'll certainly know about it because we'll be shouting it from the rooftops. Yeah, we'll just have to wait. We'll just have to wait and see, because it's the first time that this has been looked at in this particular participant group. Okay, and I will just finish with a sort of a what am I doing, what are sort of plans have we got in future. Well, one of the things that's really important in this area is around the essential oils themselves. Now, you may not be aware, but essential oils differ a lot, and they differ not so much as a consequence of who the manufacturer is or whatever, but it's depending on when the rosemary was sourced and where it was sourced from. The same species of rosemary plant grown in Turkey and grown in the UK will have very different profile of components within it. The same species of rosemary plant grown in two fields adjacent to one another will have different components in it. The same rosemary plant in the morning and in the evening will have a different set of components in it because it's a living thing and it changes. One thing that I'm interested in is looking at the different components in different essential oils in quite some detail to see if we can find out what the most effective constituent makeup of the essential oil is. This is not something that we have done at all yet, but it's something that I think is really important. And the reason I think it's really important is there are at least 3 compounds that are active in the brain, as has been shown by biochemical studies. So there's 1,8-cineol, which I've talked about, which is the most the largest quantity of active components in rosemary essential oil by volume. But there are others, rosmarinic acid and carnosic acid. These both have activities on the brain. Now, one thing that I very strongly believe is that the effects that we have seen for rosemary are not a consequence of just 1,8-cineol activity. Although it is active, I believe that what you have in the essential oil, as in so many natural products, is you have a synergistic effect. It's when you bring the parts together, you get a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And the activity of rosemary is a consequence of having all of the right different constituents in the right concentrations at the same time. And sometimes they're going to be wrong. And I have run studies where I have found no effect of rosemary on cognition. And I've used lots of different essential oils over the years, and I've had students use lots of different ones. And so I'm convinced that it's a question of having the right things there in the right amounts. This synergistic effect is very, very common in natural products, natural compounds that have a range of different effects, where we see you get 2 or 3 things together, you get a bigger effect than you do if you have them individually. So that's one thing that I want to do. Next thing that we've got planned is looking at aromas and driving behavior and the potential to increase or improve driving ability through the application of aromas. So we've got a funding bid that's going in shortly for that. Now, there are, of course, a myriad of different car air fresheners and things. Most of them are quite vile. But I'm working with somebody in industry who has come up with a creative diffuser device for cars that will present aroma intermittently into the car, and we're going to see if it can actually affect driving behavior. And then a third one that I'm interested in doing is actually the sort of a combination between oxygen and rosemary. So Boost Oxygen, the company, have actually come out with a rosemary Aroma Oxygen cylinder. So natural interest as to whether the effects of oxygen that we found previously and the effects of rosemary that we found previously can perhaps be combined to give further benefit. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to do my best to answer any questions that you may have.
We've got quite a few that have come in either sort of collectively or individually.
Okay, I'll give it a shot.
People would love your slides. I don't know whether we're allowed to have them or not, but that would be quite nice. I'm also concerned that Spike the cat hasn't been fed, but hopefully he's okay. A key question has been about the best oils, which you were kind of answering then. It's sort of ongoing, isn't it, to find what that best oil is. Obviously, I mentioned earlier on before we joined the call fully that people will have heard of doTERRA. How much of that oil should be used? Is that one that you have any experience of the benefits around specific oils, specific amounts of them?
It's interesting, isn't it? So as I say, I've used a lot of different essential oils simply because I'm curious as much as anything. I am not in a position to be able to say that I think any of them are the ones to use, because, as I say, I'm not entirely sure which might be the best ones to use. How much to use is interesting in that I think it's something that you need to be comfortable with. So if you're inhaling the aroma of an essential oil, then it needs to be at a level that you find comfortable, because it's not just the compounds that you're going to absorb into your blood, it's also the sense of the smell as well on you. And if you're not enjoying it, then don't, then don't do it. It's, as I say, these effects, it's not sort of a panacea. It's going to have this, it's going to cure everything, but it can be beneficial. But it's only going to be beneficial if you're enjoying doing it anyway. And although I have not found any evidence yet, there's a distinct possibility that, like oxygen, you get too much of something, then it starts having an effect in the opposite direction than a beneficial effect. As I say, I've not got any direct evidence of that, except from research assistants who've been testing people all day in the lab with the aroma, who say it gets a bit much by the end of the day. But that's as far as I could say. So yeah, there's a lot, I think that there's a lot of value in saying, well, using a reputable company's essential oil makes sense, because there's lots, as I say, there's lots out there, but using a reputable company's essential oil would appear to make sense. But again, I've no idea which is the best. I've no idea which is got the best combination. It could be a lifelong job finding that out, because there are so many different compounds in there, and some of them in really tiny amounts, and you don't know whether you're measuring the right ones. It's hard to say.
Another question that somebody's asked, and this works perfectly with I've got my rosemary tea here, and one of our health practitioners recommends leaving your lid on so that you inhale it as well as drink it. Mm-hmm. Is there benefit to just even using the rosemary that's on our window ledge or in our garden?
Yes, there certainly is. So I've done a couple of studies with fresh rosemary. And now, to be fair, we did get participants to eat quite a lot of fresh rosemary, and that was a bit of we were trying to think how to get the fresh rosemary into people. We tried freeze drying it, and then, well, people don't really want to eat just freeze dried. It's just horrible. So then we were asking them to eat fresh leaves, and they did, and But the amount that we needed really to get them to eat in the fresh leaves, it wasn't a reasonable amount for your everyday. But we did find that in the same way as with the aroma, that eating the fresh rosemary led to an increase in 1,8-cineol in blood serum. So we took some blood serum samples again and improved performance. But as I say, it was quite a lot of it that we were getting people to eat. But in answer to your question, then, yes, there is distinct possibility that having rosemary tea and using the fresh rosemary that you do have could still have some beneficial effects. I did do one study that wasn't rosemary tea, it was chamomile and peppermint tea that showed definite benefit from peppermint tea on some measures of performance. So yeah, tea is a good way. The thing about tea, of course, is that it's good because it releases the compounds from the plant well, because it's hot. And yes, because it also creates the aroma, you're also inhaling it as well as drinking it. I didn't sort of mention this, but one of the reasons that I like inhalation of aromas is because it's the cleanest and quickest way to get active components into the body and particularly into the brain. When you ingest anything, it has to go through the digestive system, which is a really fierce and chemically active system, and all sorts of breakdown things can occur to anything that you swallow. When you inhale something, goes to the lungs. If it gets absorbed by the lungs, as we've seen that 1,8-cineol can, and presumably the other compounds as well, the next place it goes from the lungs is the brain, straight to the brain. No first pass metabolism through the liver or anything like that. Anything you inhale goes straight to the brain. That's why cigarettes are so addictive. That nicotine goes straight from the lungs straight to the brain. So that's why I like aromas. And so, yeah, if you're making tea, you're not only getting it through swallowing it, but you're inhaling it as well. So you're getting two means of administration.
I am aware of the time and that some people who have joined us today are from Sheffield Hallam University as well. And some of those will be coming onto our pilot study shortly as well. So I want to be able to give them a break. I want your cat to be able to be fed as well. If there are additional comments or questions, please either message us on info@Salus. Mark, you've got a lot of your research is out there anyway, isn't it? It's on the internet if you want to search there. And if there's anything in particular that you want to know, please let me know. And I'm sure, because he's been so kind, I'm sure that he would answer those questions, and then we can message those back.
Absolutely, yeah. If you have any questions, Jane, you can just pass them on to me.
Jane, just that CPAP machine one. I wondered if you could ask Mark that, or
we'll check through that one at another time to see what the manufacturer of your specific one has, whether it's oxygen, general air, or whatever. Okay. But as I say, Mark, thank you so much for your time today. Hopefully that's benefited everybody to just add a little bit more rosemary, as you said, not permanently, not constantly, but just to boost our cognitive abilities. That's brilliant. Yeah. I think that's been gratefully received. And someone's off to buy their rosemary tea already.